Okay, we can start. Thank you. So probably you already know matching criteria because matching criteria exists for the classical normal dependency. But with this enhancement, we are going to apply the criteria also for the cross dependency in the definition of the bind between shadow job and remote job. We will act at two different levels. At the database level, where you can define the shadow job and you can insert the matching criteria, and also at the plan level, where you can browse this information inside the shadow job and you can use this information where the bind is established between shadow and remote job. When you define a shadow job in the cross-dependency area, now you can only define, so you can define the default value is used, and the default value for the matching criteria is the closest preceding. You can now add with this enhancement 3 more criteria: the same schedule date, the within a relative interval, and within an absolute interval. You can define these matching criteria from ISPF panel, but also from the dynamic workload console interface. I want to highlight that this enhancement will be available at the end of the year, so we are working on this. So it is available with the dynamic workload console version 10.2.6 and also the controller version 10.2 small program enhancement 3. It is very important also to reduce the gap between the distributed engine and the controller, because on the distributed side, you can define the 4 different matching criteria. To enable the feature, you need the latest version of the Z controller both on the remote engine and on the shadow engine. Remote and shadow must be at the latest level, that is 10.2 SPE3. If the shadow engine is lower than the remote one, only one matching criteria is allowed, and this criteria is the closest preceding. If the remote engine is lower version than the shadow one, also in this case, the remote will apply all the closest preceding. We can see now some user scenario. For example, if a customer wants to split the controller, in this case, the customer can define a cross-dependency between different engines, the remote engine, for example, and the shadow engine in case of the cross-dependency. Thanks to this enhancement, the user can also choose other temporal relationship between the job, because we have now 4 different matching criteria to define. It is useful also if a user has a mixed environment, for example, with Z controller and distributed engine. In this case, the user can apply the knowledge gain on the distributed engine also for the Z controller in the bind between Z remote job and Z shadow job. If a customer wants to define a shadow job, he can choose ISPF panel or the workload designer on the dynamic workload console. On ISPF, he can create an application, define a shadow job that runs on a remote engine workstation, inserting the important information about the remote. So, for example, the job occurrence name, the operation number, and also the matching criteria. After that, he can decide to add this application to the plan, and when the bind is established from ISPF option 5.3 and B.14, he can view the remote data, including the matching criteria defined on the database. From the dynamic workload console, this scenario is more or less the same. From the workload designer of the console, you can create an application and add to this application a those shadow job. In this case, we will have another panel where you can define the matching criteria, and we will see this later in another slide. After that, the user can decide to add the application to the plan from the plan section of the console, and from the monitoring section, he can monitor the status of the job, but for now, he can't view the matching criteria and the information about the remote. Probably we will expand this set in the next SPE when we increase the number of information in the orchestration monitor. Now we can focus on the matching criteria. The default value is the closest preceding. In this case, the matching predecessor is the one with the nearest preceding input arrival time. For closest preceding, the user don't need to define a bind interval, but we have, in this case, a sort of fake interval because the occurrence to bind is found before the shadow input arrival. So the search will be done from the shadow input arrival and going back. So we have a sort of fake interval where the occurrence is found. For the same scheduled date, we have also in this case a sort of a fake interval because the user doesn't need to define a bind interval, but the bind interval is the day where the shadow input arrival is defined. So the left boundary of this interval is the start of day, and the right boundary of this interval is the end of day. Also in this case, the matching predecessor is the one with the nearest input arrival time within the same day of the shadow job. And the shadow input arrival is always within the interval. So the search will be performed before the shadow input arrival in this section. And if no match is found, will be executed after the shadow input arrival within the bind interval. In this slide, we can see some example. We have the closest preceding, so matching criteria is C, closest preceding, and we can see that the bind interval can start, for example, in the current plan and long-term plan, but can end outside them. Or, for example, the bind interval can be inside current plan and long-term plan, or can be in the long-term plan at the starting point and ends in the long-term plan. We have also two other criteria. In this case, the user must define an interval from ISPF or Workload Designer. For a relative interval, the maximum predecessor is the one with the closest input arrival time within the interval specified. So from ISPF, you need to define for the relative hours, minutes, and when, before or after the shadow input arrival. In this example, I put this value. We have this picture, very simple, with the shadow input arrival in the middle. The left boundary is 1 hour and 12 minutes before the shadow input arrival, as you can see here. And the right boundary is 2 hours and 22 minutes after shadow input arrival. And we can see the two defined from ISPF. On the base of the interval, the bind interval can be entirely after, entirely before the shadow input arrival, or the input arrival can be within the interval, as you can see here. The absolute interval is more or less the same. The only difference is that you need to specify other option when you define the absolute interval. In this case, time, days, and when. Also in this case, we have a very simple example. with input arrival within the interval. The left boundary is 6 days before shadow input arrival at noun.12, as you can see here. And the right boundary is 7 days after shadow input arrival at 1 p.m. and 13. Both for relative and absolute interval, if the shadow input arrival is inside the bind interval, the search will be executed before and then after if no match is found. As mentioned before, in this example, we have the three cases, the three situations, when the IA is entirely after the bind interval, when the input arrival is entirely before the bind interval, and when the input arrival is within the bind interval, on the basis of the value that you have put in this panel. We have modified the ISPF panel. So from the ZOS remote job info panel, you can now see on the database the resolution or matching criteria. And running this new command, dept, you can now have a new panel, this one, where you can define the matching criteria. In this case, we have the absolute interval with the option, time, days, and when. From the current plan, you can browse this information. So from the panel browsing ZOS remote job info in the current plan, you have all the information already present in this panel, like the application ID, input arrival, operation number, and so on. And thanks to this new enhancement, we have also the resolution criteria with the value that you have set in the database. Okay, from the workload designer on the dynamic workload console, you will have a new panel. When you define a shadow just job, you have the remote job section when you can insert the occurrence name and operation number of the remote job. And from now, you have also another panel, the matching criteria, when you can choose different value, closest, same, schedule date, and so on with the option. Now I want to highlight the general rules for bind. The rule number one that we have seen previously is that if the shadow input arrival is within the bind interval, the search is always performed before the input arrival, and if no match is found, after the input arrival. Rule number two, if the instance that I want to link with my shadow job is within the bind interval, but only in the LTP and not in the current plan, in this case, the bind is established. But the additional information that we have seen here, for example, not application ID, but input arrival, workstation, and job name, will be sent when we have an extension of the current plan, and this particular instance will be added to the current plan. Rule number three, if the instance is inside the bind interval but outside LTP and CP, in this case, the bind remains in waiting status. When this instance is added to the long-term plan, the bind will be established, and additional information will be sent when this occurrence will be in the current plan. We have a simple example. In this case, we have a shadow input arrival at 9 a.m. and bind interval that starts at 10 a.m. and ends at 1 p.m. We have two different occurrences, JS4 at 11 a.m. and noun. In this case, the search will be performed always in the bind interval, and the first occurrence that is found is this. So the winner of this challenge is JS4 at 11 a.m. Now I have a little surprise for you. because there is a quiz time. If someone is brave and wants to try to answer, there is a very simple quiz. The first, I'm starting to introduce the scenario. We have also in this case input arrival at 2 p.m. with this bind interval that starts at 9 a.m. and ends at 8 p.m. And we have two occurrences, JS10 at noon and JS10 at 7 p.m. Which is the correct answer? So which is the occurrence to bind in this case? We have these three options.
Any volunteers?
Someone brave?
One, to be honest.
1, 2, or 3?
I would have guessed one.
I would go
One. Yes, congratulations.
Oh.
This is correct answer.
I'm 10% off my next license cost now.
Okay, second quiz. In this case, we have the same bind interval, same input arrival, but the occurrence is only one, JS10 at 7 p.m. And we have three different solutions. The search is executed before the input arrival. The bind fails because no matches are found. Second, the search is executed before and after the input arrival, but the bind fails because no matches are found in the long-term plan. Number 3, the bind is executed before and after the input arrival, but no matches are found in the long-term plan, and the bind remains in waiting status until a match is found. Which is the correct answer? This is a little bit more difficult. 3. Yes, congratulations. Very good. Now cross-dependency doesn't have a secret for you. Okay, after this quiz, the presentation is ends, and I don't know if you have a doubt or question about matching criteria.